Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Can I have your attention, please? Good. I hope you all had a good night's sleep. Right. Anyway, our final full day. And our next presenter is the reason why we're here today, because, as you remember in my remarks earlier, it was at a theology day sponsored by St. John's University School of Theology and Seminary in Collegeville, Minnesota, that Deacon John Fridley heard Noreen speak and came up during the break and said, let's do the next conference on ecumenism and interreligious life. So Noreen, you get all the credit for all these 130 people here, so great. So let me tell you a bit about our speaker today. Noreen Hertzfeld is the Nicholas and Bernice Roeder Professor of Science and Religion at St. John's University and the College of St. Benedict in Minnesota. She has degrees from her doctorate from Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, master's from St. John's University and also Penn State, and also a BA from St. Olaf College. As I was talking to Noreen last night, I was reminded that she grew up in the Lutheran faith, but being in Pennsylvania became a Quaker. So it's good that we have in our conversation about ecumenism and interreligious that we involve all kinds of people, as Father Walta said yesterday. She holds degrees in both computer science and theology. What an interesting combination. And teaches in both fields. Noreen is the author of In Our Image, Artificial Intelligence and the Human Spirit, and several other publications, and she's going to be shortly publishing a new book that she may tell us something about. But numerous articles on topics ranging from the prospects of reconciliation between Muslims and Christians in Bosnia and many other aspects. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you Dr. Noreen Hertzfeld. Let's give her a good welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Bob. Good morning to all of you. It's such a lovely morning, as long as we're inside where it's cool. Okay, so this morning we're going to talk about Islam. Understanding Islam. And I think for many of us, and let's see if I can get rid of that thing. Okay, as I look out there, I see most of you are my age, or at least. So, when we think of Islam, a lot of us think about that picture that you see on the upper right. We lived through 9/11. We remember it vividly. I'll bet every one of you remembers where you were and what you were doing when that happened. I know I had just taken my car in to be fixed, and I'm getting into the shuttle to be driven back to the university, and the guy said, I just heard on the radio that a plane hit the towers in New York. And so I imagined this really tiny plane, And then when I got off at school, everybody was standing around and staring at screens, and so this has colored our view of Islam. The picture on the bottom, ISIS, has colored our view of Islam. Okay? Some of us might think about other aspects of Islam, like the Hajj. But generally, by the media here in the United States, and by some of the things that we have lived through, we tend to think about Islam as a faith that is pretty foreign, that is maybe pretty warlike, that is not kind to women. And what I want to do today is try to disabuse you of all of those thoughts. Yes, these things are real. 9/11 happened. ISIS happened. Okay? But there is so much more to a faith with billions of followers. And in many ways, the Muslims are the closest in faith to us as Christians. of any other of the major religions. So, here's the question. How can I say that? In other words, who gets to say what any particular faith is all about? Okay, well, here are some possibilities. So you could say, well, there's a central authority who says what it is. Catholicism, right? Okay, you could say, well, the Pope gets to say what it is. But there are a lot of people who will even dispute that among Catholics and say, well, maybe not this Pope, you know. So is there a central authority who says what it is? Do you say, well, let's go back to the spirit, intent, or example of an early founder? You know, so among us Christians, of course, a lot of folks, particularly among evangelicals, they'll say, well, what would Jesus do? We're just going to try to go back. We'll follow the example of Jesus. So maybe we should look at Muhammad and the example of Muhammad. Now, we're also people of the book. So we could say it's the sacred text. Now, I grew up as a Lutheran, so sola scriptura, right? So you could say, well, it's what is in the sacred text, you know. So we go look at the Bible. Muslims go look at the Quran. Or finally, you could say, well, it's what the adherents to that faith actually say and do. How do they live it out? You know, in other words, by their fruits you shall know them, right? So in some ways, you could say, well, maybe it's a combination of all four of these. How do we get to say what a religion is? There are probably aspects of all of these that could figure into it. So let's take a look at all four of these as regards Islam. And we can knock off the first one really quickly. What a central authority says it is. Well, as I mentioned, in Catholicism, you have a central authority. And the Pope can, at some point, finally declare, you know, that is within the bounds of the faith, that is not within the bounds of the faith. But there is no such central authority in Islam. There are imams, but an imam in Islam is really more like a Jewish rabbi in the sense that the imam is a prayer leader and a teacher, but not even as much of an authority as a priest would be. And there are, you know, grand imams of certain countries, but again, their authority is just that they are considered sort of the teacher above other teachers. But really, there is no central authority in Islam. So there's nobody who could come out, for example, and say, oh, whoa, ISIS isn't Islamic, it's beyond the pale. Would have been nice if there had been such an authority, but there just isn't. So although many imams signed a statement, and by many I mean hundreds of imams, signed a statement saying ISIS is not Islamic, and here are the reasons. Here are all the ways that they're going against the tenets of our faith. It never made it into the press, right? I mean, how many of you heard or read about imams coming out, you know, with statements against ISIS? Anybody? One or two? Okay, but not a lot. All right? And in fact, a lot of people were saying, well, why don't other Muslims speak out? Well, they did. But they just didn't get heard because they didn't have that kind of an authoritative voice that Catholicism has in Rome. So central authority isn't actually going to do it for us. So we better look at the other three. So let's take a look at those. So here's a slide on, yeah, I'm sorry, our screens are so small here that most of you probably can't read this, but you can see the colors on it, right? So this was the Pew Research Center who did a poll on ISIS among Muslims, and the question they asked was, do you have a blank opinion of the Islamic militant group in Iraq and Syria known as ISIS. And orange is unfavorable, and green is favorable. So, as you see the colors, at least, on there, you can see that in almost all of these predominantly Muslim countries, the unfavorable view of ISIS is huge. So the imams were speaking out, the people were speaking out, but it really wasn't being heard. Okay, so let's go to our second one. What about the spirit, the intent, the original founding of the faith? So we're going to go to the beginning of the faith. That takes us to Mecca, which is in present-day Saudi Arabia, right there on sort of the western side of the the eastern side of the Red Sea, but the western side of the Arabian Peninsula. And the Prophet Muhammad is born in the year 570. So it kind of places him in time. His father died shortly after his birth. His mother died before he turned 5. So Muhammad was an orphan. He was taken in first by his grandfather, and then when his grandfather died, by an uncle who looked after him. But, as you know from reading the scriptures in the Old and New Testament, the plight of orphans back in those times was very real. If you did not have a father to look out for you, to care for you, to get you set up in life. So Muhammad comes from, although he came from a good tribe, he's an orphan. He doesn't have father or mother. Mecca at this time is dominated by the Qurayshi tribe. Okay? It's a center for trade. If we go back, there are trade routes running up and down the edge of the Red Sea down to the area that is present-day Yemen. And they're trading in spices from India. They're trading in things like gold, frankincense, and myrrh, coming up that trade route. And Mecca, as you could see, sort of being not quite halfway up from Yemen towards the Levant, it was a good stopping place. So the trading caravan stopped in Mecca, and so this trade made the Qurayshi tribe quite wealthy. And it also was a center for pilgrimage. The Qurayshi were basically polytheists. They came originally from the desert and had settled in Mecca. And people in the desert tend to see the desert as populated by spirits. They're very animistic. And this moves quite easily into a polytheistic view of there being gods and goddesses for everything that happens out in nature. Now, because they were a center for trade, the Meccans decided that there was also good money to be made in pilgrimages, and they had this center for pilgrimage with a small building in the center called the Kaaba. The Kaaba predates Islam. Okay, and in the Kaaba or around the Kaaba, they had statues or on the walls of the Kaaba frescoes for 350 different gods and goddesses. So anytime anybody came through on the trade route and they said, well, why don't you go visit our Kaaba, and they'd say, well, I didn't see a statue for our god or our goddess. They'd say, well, next time you come, bring one, and we'll put it there. And so by the time of Muhammad, there are 350 gods and goddesses represented in and around the Kaaba. And this includes a fresco on the inner walls of the Kaaba of Jesus and Mary. So Everybody's there. The Qurayshi are happy. They're getting rich on trade. They're getting rich on pilgrimages. Okay, what's not to like, right? Okay, so Muhammad goes into the family business. He belongs to a minor clan of the Qurayshi trade. And his uncle is a very minor trader and gets Muhammad from a fairly young age into working with the camel caravans that are going back and forth. And finally, Muhammad makes a name for himself. He's good at this, okay? And he is hired by a wealthy widow named Khadijah, and Khadijah moves him up in the ranks until he is leading her caravans that are going from Mecca up to the area that would now be Syria and Jordan. Okay, and so Muhammad is the leader of these caravans. Now, when Muhammad is taking these caravans across the desert and up into the area, there's now Jordan, Syria, maybe western parts of what is now Israel. Who's he going to be encountering? Christians. Yes, he's going to be encountering Christians. Some of them he's going to be dealing with at the other end, selling goods, buying goods. Okay? Others are going to be out in the desert, monks. Okay, because this is the time of the big flourishing of the desert fathers and mothers. Okay, and so as he is crossing the desert, he's probably going to be stopping at times at some of these sort of proto-monasteries or encountering hermits out in the desert. So this is probably a part of his formation. They're going to be exchanging stories. They're going to be talking about their beliefs. Okay, and he's going to be encountering some Jews as well, but those are probably going to be more urban encounters when he gets to Damascus, places like that, where he's selling goods. Anyway, he's good at this. He comes back at a certain point. His employer, who is 15 years older than he is, so he's about 25 by now, no, about 20, I guess. Yeah, she's about 35, proposes to him. Khadijah says, I have been watching you. You're an honest man. I like the way you deal with people. You're good. You're upright. You've been faithful. Marry me. And so he does. So he marries Khadijah. And as far as we can tell, it was a real love match. She is his only wife until her death. So he marries her, and she proposed to him. So, ladies, if you haven't gotten there yet, give it a try. Okay. And so in 610, so Muhammad is 40 at this point. And one thing that I find really interesting is that Muslims have a saying that no man has reached the age of reason until he is 40. Oh, can some of you back that up? And they actually say of the story of Jesus that, we say Jesus began his ministry at 30, right, usually? And they say, no, you must have that wrong. Jesus must have been 40. He was just too wise to have been any younger. Anyway, Muhammad is 40, and he is troubled by what he is seeing in Mecca. The Quraysh have gotten rich, okay, on trade. So what happens then in a society? What has happened in our own society as we've gotten richer? There gets to be this big bifurcation, this big social distance, this big wealth gap between the rich and the poor. the tribes had always had this ethic that says you've got to look after everybody in your tribe. You know, that you're responsible for everyone in your tribe. They need to be taken care of. Now, Muhammad had experienced this himself when he was orphaned at such a young age. But what he started to see by the time he was 40 was that this, because they were now living in an urban setting in Mecca, this tribal ethic was breaking down. And the members of the Qurayshi tribe in particular, who were not wealthy, were not being well taken care of. And they were getting to be much more of a divide between the rich and the poor. And this bothered him. And he used to go out to this mountain outside of town called Jabal al-Nur, the Mountain of Light. It's now called the Mountain of Light. I don't know what it was called at that time. And you can see a picture of the mountain on the left. And he would climb partway up it, about halfway up it, to a cave. You can actually see it, but it's pretty small on our pictures. But if you see kind of a black dot right in the center, that's his cave. And he would go there to meditate, to be alone, to think through things. And so one of these times, he's gone up to the mountain to be alone, just to think. And suddenly he is seized by a presence. He said it felt like somebody grabbed him and was just squeezing all the air and the life out of him. And he hears a voice that says, recite. Now, the Meccans were by and large a semi-literate society at best. Okay, some people were literate enough that they were keeping the records for trade and all of that. But in general, the stories of the tribe were kept by a group of people called Kahin, who were professional poets and soothsayers, and they were the ones, if you think in the Greek tradition of Homer, you know, that would take the stories of the tribe and turn them into these, you know, long, beautiful stories and recite these to keep people amused in the evening and to carry down the traditions and the stories and the history of the tribe. And this was their profession. So Muhammad says back to this voice that tells him to recite, I'm not a Kahin. I'm not a reciter. Okay? But the voice still says, recite in the name of the Lord who created you from a clot of blood. And the first revelations of the Quran come to Muhammad. And he stumbles out of the cave and starts running for home. He's scared to death. Okay? And he said he got, you know, kind of down from the mountain, and he said he turned around and he looked back, and the whole sky was filled with the presence of this angel, who he later thought or felt was the angel Gabriel. So he runs home and he throws himself in Khadijah's lap. He's shaking, and he says, you know, in the vernacular, I've lost it. You know? He said, I think I'm going crazy. I was up on the mountain. I had this weird sensation. I heard voices. And she said, well, what did the voices say? And so he told her, and she said, let's go talk to my cousin. My cousin Warja, he is a Christian. And he knows more about these things. I think that, you know, there were these people called prophets, and I don't know much about them. Let's go talk to a Christian. So they go to talk to her cousin, and he says, yes, God has spoken to people through history. God has spoken through angels, like the Annunciation for Mary. So this sort of thing does happen. And he said, but it never goes very well. So don't be happy that this happened. And so there you have it. The first people to believe that Muhammad was a prophet and actually heard the message from God were a woman and a Christian. Okay? Anyway, he keeps getting these revelations. And he tells the people around him, his wife, others. But thinking about what Warzer said, that this doesn't usually go very well, it kind of kept it to himself for quite a few years. He never told, the community at large or his tribe at large. For 3 years. Okay, finally, after 3 years, he decides, plus he's starting to get kind of goaded by the angel who's going, aren't you going to tell anybody? It's not like I'm telling you this just for you. Get out there and tell somebody. So he finally gets the elders of his tribe together, and he says to them, what would you say if I told you there was an army right over that hill that was going to attack us? And they said, we would believe you. You're an upright man. He said, what would you say if I told you I've been getting revelations from God? And they all said, no. Nope. So then he said, will nobody believe me? And his 10-year-old cousin says, well, yeah, cousin, I believe you. Okay. So we kind of added a child to the woman and the Christian who believed him. But slowly, as he starts telling, and most of these early revelations that he's getting would sound they could live very happily in the Old Testament. They're basically about, you've got to treat the orphan well, treat the widow well, stop getting all wrapped up in your wealth, and, start doing good in the community. Or they're about the glory of God, like the Psalms. Okay? And so after a while, people start listening to this. They're also about the fact that there is one God. Now, this is a problem for the Qurayshi. Why? They got 350 statues that people are coming on pilgrimage to see and spending their money, right? And so for the Qurayshi, they start to see this as a danger to their pocketbook. The worst kind, right? So they start, slowly, people from Muhammad's tribe start believing him. People from some other tribes are starting to say, yeah, this makes sense. There was a group in Mecca of people who already were monotheists. They were called the Hanif. And now they're saying, yeah, well, this kind of matches what we've already believed, that there really is one God, not a gazillion of them. Okay. And so they start kind of coming over, but they're not very many. A small group. Meanwhile, the Qurayshi start putting their heads together and saying, we got to stamp this out before it gets out of hand, because this is going to hurt us. So they start persecuting the Muslims, basically sanctioning them. They can't buy or sell in the main markets. Okay, this leads to a great deal of suffering among the early Muslims, a great deal of hunger. And in 619, Muhammad's wife Khadijah dies, and so does his uncle, who had been like a father to him, who had taken him in. So this is just a very, very hard time for him. However, what happens is that there is a town some ways away called Yathrib, and in Yathrib there are 5 different tribes living there. Okay, and 3 of them are Jewish, and 2 of them are Arab, and they are not getting along very well, and they decide what they need is mediation. They need a mediator, and they have heard of Muhammad by this time, and they decide that he might make a good mediator. So they send representatives down to Mecca and ask Muhammad if he would come to Yathrib and serve as their mediator. And this, again, is an official function within the tribal system in Arabia at this time, that they often had people who were dedicated. They were called hakim, and they were mediators. Right now, we might think of them as sort of a cross between counselors and part of the judicial system, who would arbitrators, who would arbitrate disputes. So they ask if Muhammad will come and be their hakim. And he realizes that getting out of Mecca might not be all that easy. So he tells his followers, look, let's all move up to Yathrib, but we can't just all get up and go at once. So his followers start going up to Yathrib in small groups. Small group leaves, and a few weeks later, another small group leaves, and a month later, another small group leaves. Finally, only Muhammad and his cousin are left, Ali, and so he thinks that they're going to the Meccans will try to kill him before he goes to Yathrib. So the night that he thinks the Meccans are going to come, he gets out of town, and Ali sleeps in his bed. And when the Meccans break into the house, they find Ali, and they don't find Muhammad. So they don't kill Ali. And turns out that they get up. Although, as you can see, if you can see the picture, Muhammad ends up taking a very circuitous route to get there. So there's sort of the white route that's the direct route, and he takes the green route that kind of snakes all over the place, just because he's worried about being followed. In Yathrib, which later comes to be known as Medina. Medina is simply Arabic for the city. It comes to be known as the city of the prophet, and then just shortened to the city. He does manage to get these tribes to stop their disputes, to stop warring, and in a sense becomes the leader of the town and somewhat unifies all those 5 tribes, along with the sort of tribe that he brought himself of Qurayshi from Mecca. And Medina becomes fairly prosperous. Okay? Now, this turns out to be good and bad. Okay, on the good side, the community in Medina is strengthened. One of the things, though, that you notice is Muhammad becomes, in some ways, both the spiritual and the political leader in Medina. Now, this is going to shape the faith as it goes forward, because we think about having a separation between church and state. But if you go back to the roots of Islam, there is no separation. Muhammad is both the spiritual leader, the imam of the community, the prayer leader, and he is the political leader as well. So for Muslims, when they go back to their history, they say, you don't need to separate church and state. The best way would be the way Muhammad did it, and that's not separate. In a sense, Muhammad becomes the sheikh of a new tribe. And this is a tribe now that is not built on bloodlines, as all the tribes had been up until now, but is more of a political gathering. And so this, again, is new. And in some ways it echoes some of what you hear from the Apostle Paul in his letters, that we're now talking about a new order, not based on bloodlines, but based on belief and on people making a free choice to be a part of this community. And then his community is then guided by these ongoing revelations that he continues to have. And this becomes the basis for the Quran. Okay, what are some of the things that were guiding this community? Community is guided both by things that are in the Quran, which we'll get to in a minute, and also by sayings of Muhammad and doings of Muhammad that were not revelations from on high. They were just from him. Okay? Here are two of them that I think are quite representative of them. So the first one says that Muhammad held up his hand with two fingers, locked right together, and said, "I and the person who looks after an orphan and provides for him will be in paradise like this close." Okay, you can see here again his concern for orphans. Well, he was one. Okay, he also says, Islam began as a stranger and it will return to being a stranger, so blessed are the strangers. Well, again, I think he felt like a stranger within his own tribe, and he is aware that the Muslims who had to flee Mecca and arrive in Medina were strangers in Medina, and that they were accepted, that they were brought in by people in Medina who took them into their houses and helped them. So he stresses care for the less fortunate. Okay, here are a few others. So one of the things he said was, the strong man is not one who is good at wrestling. The strong man is one who controls himself in a fit of rage. Good advice. And what I think is some of the best advice here is that he was asked by some people, well, if I put complete trust in God, in Allah, do I need to tie up my camel? And he said, trust in Allah, but tie up your camel first. Okay? Now, I'm going to take a little footnote here to talk about the word Allah. Okay, we think, sometimes it's presented to us in the media that Allah is the name of the God that Muslims worship. But what you really have there is a contraction. Al is simply the word in Arabic for the. Okay, think of all the words in English that begin with al, I'll start because I'm a computer scientist, so algorithm, algebra, alchemy. The al is always just the. Okay? Then you have la as the second part. Okay? La is basically just the letter L. Now, have you ever heard of God referred to as El? El Shaddai? Okay. Yes. So, all you've got in the word Allah is the God. Literally. That's all it says. The is there to stress monotheism. The God. There is only one God. And otherwise, it's just God. And it's the same word for God that you find in Hebrew in the Old Testament. So I think, when we can use Allah, but there's also no problem in referring to the God of Muslims simply as God or the God, because that's what it would be in English. Okay, so the community is also being guided by the Quran. So that takes us to the sacred text. So this was the third of our things of how do you tell what a religion is all about. Well, you look at the sacred text. You look at their scripture. So let's take a look at what is in the Quran. First line of the Quran. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Every single chapter of the Quran begins with these words. So these are the most common words within the Quran. And interestingly enough, it isn't just that the chapters begin with those words, but within the chapters, you will often find that when Allah is referred to, right after Allah's name comes Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the most compassionate, the most merciful. So God is described throughout the Quran most frequently as compassionate and merciful. Now let's take a look at the rest. This is the first surah or chapter of the Quran. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. All praise belongs to God, Lord of the worlds, most compassionate, most merciful. Ruler of the day of judgment. It is you we worship and your aid we seek. Show us the straight path, the way of those you have graced, not of those deserving anger, nor of those who wander lost. This first surah, very short, is recited in each of the daily prayers of Muslims. Now, Muslims pray 5 times a day. So 5 times a day, these words are recited. Okay, so what do they tell us about God? Well, He's most compassionate, most merciful. Says that twice, right? He's the ruler of the day of judgment. Why is that important? Well, if there is no day of judgment, and many of the polytheistic Arabs didn't believe there was it. They didn't believe anything happened after death. You died, you were gone. Okay, so if you think that, live it up now, right? What you do doesn't really matter. Okay, so part of the revelation that Muhammad is trying to give to the Arabs is, what you do really does matter. It does. The Muslims say, it's kind of interesting, they say, well, each of us has 2 angels, and you got 1 on each shoulder. All right? And the one on your left shoulder is writing down every bad thing you do. The one on your right shoulder, however, is writing down every good thing you do. And when you come to the day of judgment, these 2 angels will present their scrolls. All right? And you're kind of hoping that this guy's got more to say than this one. They also say, and your own body will testify on the day of judgment. Rumi has a delightful poem in which he talks first about the angels testifying on the day of judgment, and then he says, but your own body will testify. And your hand might say, I took what didn't belong to me. Your feet might say, I went where I wasn't supposed to go. And your genitals might say, so did I. That's actually in the poem. So they say on the day of judgment, these angels will testify, your body will testify, you will testify. But look up a line. Who is God? the most compassionate, the most merciful. Yeah. So that is always there. So there's quite a bit in the Meccan surahs about the Day of Judgment, saying there is a day of judgment, and you will be judged. You'll be judged on what you do. So do good, don't do bad, and woe to the people who are persecuting the orphans, and woe to the people who won't support widows, and that kind of thing. But you can read these verses and say, oh, that's kind of nasty. But they're almost always either preceded or followed with the most compassionate, the most merciful. So they will almost always say, but God is the most compassionate, the most merciful. So you never forget that, even though there are strong warnings about the Day of Judgment. Okay, then it goes on. It is you we worship, and your aid we seek. Once again, monotheism. It's you. It's you. We worship one God. We seek one God's aid through prayer. Then, show us the straight path, the way of those you have graced, not of those deserving anger, nor those who wander lost. One of the things you often find in the Quran are these sort of descriptions that you can tell come from a desert people. What is one of the worst things that can happen to somebody out in the desert? You get lost. You get off the path. Okay, we hear now, sadly, about migrants who are trying to come up through the Sonoran Desert, and they get lost, and they dehydrate, they die. The worst thing that can happen to you in the desert is to wander off the path and get lost. So, show us the straight path. Show us the path that'll get us to the next oasis as quickly as possible. And let us not be among those who wander lost. Okay, so all of this is in there. And we're going to come back to this question about the straight path, because the Arab term for the straight path, the shortest path to the next oasis, is Sharia. So when you hear about Sharia, that is the straight path. So we'll come to Sharia after our break, but let's just stick with the Quran for a few minutes. Okay, so some other things that are in the surahs that were revealed to Muhammad while he was in Mecca. A lot of Bible stories. So, you hear the story of Adam and Eve. You hear the story of Isaac, of Sarah and Hagar, and Isaac and Ishmael. You hear the story of Noah and the flood. Joseph and his coat of many colors and his brothers shows up in there. Moses and the Israelites leaving Egypt is in the Quran. The Annunciation of Jesus' birth by Gabriel and the birth of Jesus, and some stories of the ministry of Jesus. There is a whole surah or chapter of the Quran devoted to Mary. So you hear a lot about Mary. So the Bible stories are all there, the traditions of Judaism and Christianity. Now, many of them are slightly different. They're told with a little bit of a twist. So for example, Hagar is presented not as the slave of Sarah. Well, she was the slave of Sarah for a while, just given to Abraham as a concubine, but that Abraham marries her so that she is a second wife to Abraham. It is Ishmael that the Quran says was the one who was almost sacrificed by his father rather than Isaac. So you get the stories, but often there's a detail that's changed or a character that is swapped out for a different character. Most of them, however, are pretty close to being the same. The story of Adam and Eve is interesting because in that story you still get the temptation, the idea that they should not eat from the fruit of a certain tree. However, you don't get, so Eve did it and then she gave it to Adam. Instead, in the Quran, it just says, so they talked it over and they both decided the fruit looked pretty good, and had it. And you don't get the whole, it just, the thing they say is, okay, the problem is if you eat that fruit, they say it's not really the knowledge of good and evil you're going to get. It's that you're going to think you have the knowledge of good and evil and you're going to behave like tyrants. And so after they eat the fruit, God says, well, descend and now there will be enmity among you. But he says, I will clothe you, I'll give you food, and, so long as you continue to worship me, you'll be okay. So it's a little less harsh. So some of the stories are just twisted a little bit. There's also in the Meccan surahs a lot of poetry about God. I'll put one of those poems up when we come to our break time. And as I've already mentioned, an awful lot about social justice, taking care of the poor, and quite a bit about the Day of Judgment, saying what you do matters. Now, when we look at this list, you actually think, kind of sounds like a synopsis of the Bible with a little, with a few changes, a few editorial emendations. But, yeah, it kind of does. Okay? It's all pretty much what you're going to find in the Bible. Okay, here is the Annunciation from the Quran. So I'll just read this to you. It says, when the angel said, O Mary, indeed, God gives you glad tidings of a word, his saying, be from him, whose name is the Messiah, Jesus, the Son of Mary, held in honor in this world and in the hereafter, and of those nearest to God. He shall speak to people while still in the cradle, and in manhood he shall be from the righteous. She said, My Lord, how can I have a son when no man has touched me? He said, even so, God creates what he pleases. When he decrees, he merely says to it, be, and it is. And he will teach him the book and the wisdom and the Torah and the gospel. Okay, so you have the basics of the Annunciation. Here it just says the angels, but then later it sounds like one angel is talking, telling Mary she's going to have a son. Mary saying, no man has touched me. And he's saying that this son will be the righteous, that he will teach people and speak to people. And there's also that idea in there that you see in the Gospel of John of in the beginning was the Word. So it says, God gives you glad tidings of a word, his saying be. So it's just kind of interesting as you can see these threads of Christianity, of Christian belief, of different parts of the gospel kind of woven in a slightly different way. Here's another verse from the Quran. Indeed, Allah alone has knowledge of the hour and sends down the rain and knows what is in the wombs, and no soul perceives what it will learn tomorrow, and no soul perceives in what land it will die. Indeed, Allah is knowing and acquainted. Sometimes the Quran Quran sounds to our ears a little stilted, a little odd. A lot of this is because Arabic just doesn't translate well to English. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. So Arab speakers say the Quran is just extremely poetic, that it's beautiful in its sound. Well, of course, we don't get the sound because you put it in English, well, you've lost the sound of the original words. And the other problem is poetry is really hard to translate, right? Because you can either kind of go for what's poetic in the new language, but then that means you're probably not going to be able to stick to the literal text. But otherwise, you go for the literal text and you get something that's kind of clunky. It's not a poem anymore. And this is what we tend to get in the Quran, is something to our ears it just sounds kind of clunky. And that's because Arabic, it's a Semitic language. It doesn't work on the same rules that English and that other European languages work on. Now, there's one other thing. In Arabic, most of the words have a root of 2 or 3 consonants. And there will be whole families of words that have the same roots. And these families kind of live together in people's minds. So if you have one word with that root, it'll bring up a whole constellation of ideas that are the family of other words that are closely related. So let's think about the word Islam. Usually in English, that's translated as submission. But it has a root, S-L-M. Okay, Islam, S-L-M. The rest are vowels. Can you think of any other words built on the same root, S-L-M? Salam. Salam means peace in Arabic, related to shalom in Hebrew. Yeah, so it's interesting because when to an Arab speaker, when they hear Islam, yeah, they might think submission, but they're also going to think salam, peace. And you could say, well, it means if you submit your will to God's will, what are you going to find? You're going to find peace. So these things live together. Now, the other thing is that the earliest editions of the Quran, excuse me, were written, as I pointed out, for a group of people who had basically an oral tradition. So all they wrote down were the consonants. They didn't write down the vowels. Well, actually, Arabic doesn't. The vowels end up being like little dots, over and above the consonants. So what that means is there's also some controversy over what the vowels should have been. Okay. One of the most interesting and somewhat amusing bits of controversy is that in the part of the Quran where it says if you die in the service of God, you'll go to heaven, and heaven is described as this wonderful Middle Eastern pleasure garden. So, among all the rushing fountains and all the wonderful foods, you will also have at your disposal 70 what? Virgins is what we hear, but guess what? The same consonant root could be raisins. So, while they're talking about this wonderful pleasure garden where you're going to have all the food and all the fruit you want to eat, and then it says you'll have 70 raisins, actually makes more sense than virgins. All right, maybe we just got the wrong vowels in there. And I thought, oh boy, are some martyrs going to be really disappointed. Here's your box of Sunkist. Yeah. Yeah. So there are problems in translating the Quran. And because of this, no translation is considered to be the Quran itself. In fact, if you find a Quran that's just labeled the Quran in English, most Arab speakers are going to say, no. And a lot of times what you'll find in the title is something like the meaning of the Quran or a translation of the Quran or something, because they'll say that isn't really the Quran. Their idea of the fact that these words came to Muhammad directly from Gabriel and, he was almost possessed means you can't really change the words. There's much more of a direct connection here than we think of in the writing of the scriptures in the Bible. Now, within the Bible, we have stories of words coming directly to prophets, but we tend not to say, well, the whole Bible was dictated directly. We say, no, it came through human beings who were inspired by God, but that these weren't the actual words. So this is a difference. In the Quran, they say, but these are the actual words that Gabriel said. And then they say again, you can't translate them. You lose the poetry, you lose the beauty. They believe that even just the sound of these words has a healing effect on people. So often Muslims, if you encounter them, for example, in a hospice situation, for example, they will just play tapes of the Quran being chanted, both to soothe the patient, but also in the belief that just the sound, even if they can't any longer fathom the meaning of the text, just the sound will have some healing effect on them. Okay, also in the later surahs. Now we know that by this time, Muhammad is in a sense both the sheikh and the imam of a new tribe. These surahs now deal with practical matters. Because Muhammad is dealing with practical matters, and often in prayer he is saying, Lord, tell me what to do. I've got to help with this inheritance struggle. I've got to tell the people what to do about this or that. And so he gets revelations that are of a much more practical nature. So in the Medina surahs, we read about how to divide an inheritance, for example. Well, an interesting thing here is that you find out that if an inheritance is being divided among children, the girls get something too. Okay? Not as much as the guys, but still, they get something. What to do with food and drink, marriage and divorce, etiquette. It's interesting. There are surahs in the Quran that say, if you go to someone's house, and they say, leave me alone, leave them alone. So things of just how to deal with each other. And then the basic religious practices. Now, these surahs form the basis of what we call Sharia law. The idea that if you're trying to figure out how do you get a divorce, how should an inheritance be divided, go to the Quran and see what it says there first. And one of the things that I notice in what is laid down in these is within the strictures of, remember, we're in the 600s, right? So within the strictures of society in the 600s, what's in the Quran is very practical and unusually egalitarian. Okay? So there's practicality above all. One of the places where I see this practicality is when the Quran lays out how to fast during Ramadan, where you basically do not eat from sun up to sundown. Then it lays up, well, how do you know when it's sun up or sundown? So they say, well, if you can't see the horizon and the sun coming above or below, well, then go by when is it light enough that you can tell the difference between a black thread and a white thread. Okay, so very practical. Oh, and then, but what about, oh my gosh, what if I'm diabetic? I can't fast. And so it says, but, yes, fast from sunup to sundown. But if you can't, in fact, you don't have to if you're a child. Children don't have to. You don't have to if you're elderly. Oh, most of you are exempt, okay? You don't have to if your job requires heavy manual labor. You don't have to if you're traveling. You don't have to if you're ill. You don't have to if you're pregnant. You don't have to if you're nursing. Just lays it all out. Don't get hurt by this. And if it turns out that you can't fast for some reason, you can make it up later. You can do it another time. Okay, so practicality above all. Okay, yeah. Let's end this session by talking a little bit about the rights of women that are laid out in the Quran, that form the basis for how women are treated in Islam. Because I know that most of us tend to think Islam does not treat women very well. Now, the first thing to bear in mind is we're talking about the 600s. All right, so this was not a time when women in Europe were treated particularly well either. But what does the Quran say about women? Well, first of all, it says women will have an equal reward for their deeds as men. That when God judges people, he'll make no distinction as whether you're a man or a woman. You'll get judged on the goodness of your deeds. But it also says women have the right and the duty to obtain an education. Tell that to the Taliban. They have the right to obtain provisions from her father or brothers until she gets married. They have the right to own independent property. Sometimes I think I see the hand of Khadijah here. They have the right to provisions from their husband for all of her needs and more. And if she can make a case that the husband is not providing for all of her needs, she has the right to divorce him. She has the right to work to earn money if she needs it or wants it. Again, I think I see the hand of Khadijah here. The right to keep all her own money. When a woman gets married, she brings a dowry, but that is hers. And if her husband divorces her, she gets it back. Okay? They have the right to express their opinion and be heard. The right to negotiate marriage terms of her choice. So she should be able to negotiate. If she wants to negotiate with her husband and say, okay, but we're agreeing to a monogamous marriage, well, then he has the right to either say, well, I'm not going to marry you under that condition, or fine, that's the way it will be. The right to obtain a divorce from her husband and the right to have custody of the children after divorce. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that these rules are not always the way things are in many primary Islamic countries. We're going to get to that and why that's the case after the break. But this is the way it's laid down. And for the 600s, you got to say, holy cow. I mean, that is feminist, all right? That is equal. It's not straight equality, as I mentioned earlier. When an inheritance is being divided, the daughters receive as well as the sons, but they do not get an equal portion. And the idea is, well, the sons will be the primary breadwinners and financial keepers of a family. They should get a little more. But the women get something. For the 600s, that is almost unheard of. There are things in the Quran, very poetically, at the time, you've probably heard about this in the Greek culture, that if a family had too many daughters and another daughter is born, they might just expose the baby on the hillside. And this was part of tribal custom in Arabia. Too many daughters, you got to pay some kind of a dowry. at a certain point, you might just leave the baby out in the desert. And the Quran talks about the cries of the female infant saying, what did I do wrong to deserve this kind of treatment? One of the things that the Quran is very strong about is you don't do that. No female infanticide. And what about women's dress? We think, well, okay, women have to cover themselves from head to foot. And there will be Muslim women who will say, no, this is in the Quran, I have to do this. It isn't in the Quran, okay? The Quran talks about women's dress really in only 3 places. Here is the biggest one. It says, say to the believing women that they lower their gaze and restrain their sexual passions and do not display their ornaments except what appears thereof, and let them draw a veil over their bosoms, and they should not display their ornaments. And let them not strike their feet so that the ornaments that they hide may be known. What is a woman's ornaments? Okay. Maybe her hair. You could think about Paul, who says a hair is a woman's glory. Or you could say, let them draw their veil over their bosoms. Ooh, maybe a woman's ornaments are right here. Okay, draw a veil over your bosom. What about that? Let them not strike their feet so the ornaments that they hide may be known. Is that saying you don't walk so your boobs jiggle? I mean, that doesn't sound quite right. Okay, so here are 2 pictures from old National Geographics. Okay, and I think here are the 2 biggest possibilities that go with that text for a woman's ornaments. So you can either say, well, it's hot in the desert. People are lightly clothed, so when a woman goes out in public, she needs to put on some kind of a veil which she can draw over her bosom. Okay? But you also can think about a Bedouin culture, a mobile desert culture. What's the easiest way to keep mobile wealth? Jewelry, hang it on your wife or your wives, okay? And so let her not strike her feet so the ornaments that she has hidden might be known. We might be talking about, ladies, no ostentatious show of your wealth when you go out in public. Don't, draw a veil across your bosom. Yeah, you hide your bosom, but what else are you hiding? You're hiding all of your jewelry. And don't strike your feet so you jingle a lot and everybody knows, oh, she's rich. I think that, and it's not just me, there are other scholars who say, when you think about this push for social justice, saying that women should draw a veil to hide their ornaments when they're out in public is right in that vein. It's saying, and for you who are rich, hide it when you go out in public. Okay? A very different message than saying there is something about the female body that needs to be hidden. Now, because ornaments is kind of a vague word, this, of course, has allowed for interpretation among a variety of societies. So there are those who say, well, everything about a woman is so precious that you want to cover the whole thing. There are others who say, like the Apostle Paul, it's a woman's hair that is her glory, so she should wear a headscarf to cover her hair when she goes out. You point to that verse, it says, cover your bosom. Okay, well, most of us do that too when we go out in public. Interesting thing is, it's also about class and etiquette. Another place where people often point to in the Quran is a verse that says, when you speak to the prophet's wives, do so from behind a curtain. Where do you hang that curtain? Many have said, well, you hang the curtain on the wife. All right? But what is probably more likely is that Muhammad's house was also the mosque in Medina. And people came were coming and going from the house all the time. You're in the desert. There aren't a lot of trees. What are you going to have in the doorway to your house? A curtain. So what they're saying is, don't barge into the house and talk to the prophet's wives. Speak from the other side of the door. Okay? From behind the curtain. Now, partly, I'm going to come back to that one. I'm going to go to this one first. Partly, we know that the prophet did not veil his wives. Umar, who was a military man and very misogynistic, we'll hear about him again, used to say to the prophet, "Let your wives be veiled," but Allah's messenger did not do so. His wives were not veiled, and some of his younger wives rode out on the battlefield when the Meccans and the Medinans fought. So, pretty hard to do if you're covered from head to foot in a veil to fight. So we know that his wives were not veiled. The curtain referred to there was probably the curtain in the doorway to the house. So, just to finish up, and then we'll have our break. I love this cartoon. So you've got, for those of you who can't quite see the words, you've got the gal in her bikini and dark glasses saying, "Everything covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture." And you've got the Muslim woman saying, "Nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture." Well, yeah, you could take it either way, right? And in fact, we find I've juxtaposed these two pictures. Okay, the first is on the left is from Iran. It's the police there confronting a young woman, two young women, whose veil is not completely covering their hair, and telling them, you gotta pull that down. You're not covering. I've gone to Iran. I've talked there, and I had trouble because you don't want to have bangs when you're trying to veil because they just won't stay back. They kept creeping out. And one time when I was passing a mosque, I was accosted by what would you call them, the etiquette police or whatever. All of a sudden this guy starts hitting me with basically a feather duster. It looked like a feather duster to me. And all this Farsi, and I didn't know a word of what he was saying. I'm like, and finally some young man came over and he said, "He's telling you you're in front of a mosque and your hair is showing." I was like, oh dang, these bangs back again. On the other side, though, you have a scene from France where the police are telling a young woman she has to take her burkini off on the beach. So they are actually telling her to disrobe. So we do find this clash, but you see it, and it's a bit cruel on both sides. But, as coming back to this one, Allah's messenger, Muhammad, did not veil his wives. Okay, we're going to take our break now because it's time, and then when we come back, you have a test. So if you're sitting somewhere where you can't see very well, and I know that's probably most of you, sometime during your break, wander up to one of these screens and take a look at this. These are 7 verses. Here they are. 7 verses from the Bible or the Quran. And I just wanted to see if you can identify which verse is from which. So let's take a break. I think there's water and coffee and stuff back there. And we'll get going again, let's say 5 after 11. All right. Let's get started again. So, time for your quiz. So I've got 7 verses here. I've paired a couple of them up. So let's start with the first 2. We've got show forgiveness, speak for justice, and avoid the ignorant. Bible or Quran? Probably the Quran. Then we've got act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. You see, students don't know these Bible verses. You guys all do. But look at those two. They both talk about justice. They both talk about forgiveness or mercy. Pretty similar in what they're asking for. Okay, then we get, fight in the way of God those who fight against you but do not transgress. God does not love the transgressor. And then utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not, slay both man and woman, infant and suckling. The Bible, yeah. So, but, and then we got two more for that. Happy shall be he that take and dash their little ones against the rock. Well, some are not sure. All right. And when the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. It's probably a Quran, polytheists, right? Okay, but with those four, I think one of the things that I wanted to point out is that both the Bible and the Quran have violent verses in them. Okay, the number 6 from the Quran is probably one of the most violent in terms of war. When the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists whenever you find them. The context of this is it's the middle of a war between Mecca and Medina. But we certainly find an awful lot of war and destruction in the Bible as well. And then let's take a look at the last one. And the servants of the most merciful are those who walk upon the earth easily, and when the ignorant address them harshly, they say words of peace. Okay, with the Quran, right, we've got the most merciful shoved in there. And you can see in some of these verses that often they refer to the polytheists in Mecca simply as the ignorant. They're just the ones that don't know any better yet. Say words of peace to them. Okay, there are some problems for people of the book, as all of us monotheists are. What do we do when the book no longer matches the culture? Okay, well, we got choices. We can explain the book, but that often takes the punch away. We can retranslate, sort of rewrite the book. That often isn't too successful. Or you can say, make the culture match the book. But that isn't very successful either. So we have a problem. In many ways, none of the answers are the answer when the book no longer matches the culture it's part of. Can we pick and choose verses? Okay, well, a lot of times that's what we do. So people that want to make Islam out as being violent will pick and choose the verses about Judgment Day without the following verse saying, but God is the most compassionate, the most merciful. Or they'll pick out verses like the one about when the sacred months have passed, kill the polytheists wherever you find them, and not mention, for example, fight those who fight against you, but do not transgress. God does not love the transgressor. Or if the ignorant address you harshly, say words of peace. In other words, you can pick and choose. And Christians often do the same thing. We pick our favorite Bible texts, and we use those, and we leave out the ones that we don't care for. A fellow who was dean at the School of Theology up at St. John's for a long time, I thought had a really good saying. He said, well, those who say you have to take everything that's in the Bible literally, biblical literalists and fundamentalists, he said, I'll take them a lot more seriously when I see more one-eyed or one-handed biblical literalists walking around. We read that, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, and, well, we're not doing that, okay? So, often I think that in a way, Jesus had the best approach. He said, you follow the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law, yeah, you're not supposed to work on Sunday, but which of you, if your ox fell into a pit, isn't going to get it out? You follow the Spirit rather than the letter. So this turns us to our last area. What the adherents say or do. So what do we say about what people who call themselves Muslim or call themselves Christian do? Well, one of the problems is you're going to find adherents doing all sorts of different things. So this can be a problem. Jihad is often an issue with Islam. And from 625 to 628, the Meccans attacked Medina. Okay, the Muslims did not attack Mecca. The Meccans attacked Medina. Now, they did so for a couple of reasons. First of all, they found that as the Medinan society prospered, more people were actually leaving Mecca and joining up with the community in Medina. And they were like, whoa, wait a minute, we're losing part of our population. We don't want to do this. Secondly, because the caravans that were heading north from Mecca had to go right by Medina, the Medinans were, taking a little tax from them, okay, as they went by, and they didn't like that, okay. These wars go on for 3 years. They start and stop. I could say a lot about them, but we don't really have the time. But what I do want to say is that we think of jihad as holy war, and that is false. Okay, first of all, the word jihad just means struggle. And there's a story about Muhammad that during one of these lulls in the wars with Mecca, the troops came back, they come into the city, they're like, whew, the jihad is over. And Muhammad laughed, and he said, that was the little jihad. The greater jihad is just beginning. And so this is part of the lore of Islam, that the greater jihad, the greater struggle, is the one you wage within yourself. It's your struggle against sin and temptation. It's your struggle to do good and avoid doing evil. That is the greater jihad. Actually, taking up arms, that is called the lesser jihad in Islam. And the Quran is very clear that you can only take up arms for 2 reasons. You can only take up arms in defense. So if you have been attacked, you can take up arms. The Quran even says, if you have been attacked for no other reason than that you believe in God, you can defend yourself. And the other is if your home is taken away from you. So you're not attacked personally, but if your home is taken away, if you are exiled from your home or your home is attacked or demolished, you can fight. These are the only 2 reasons that the Quran sanctions for fighting. Now, we find that these 2 reasons show up in modern politics. So, for example, one of the reasons that Palestinians give for continuing to fight against Israel is precisely the latter. They say, because our home was taken away. And this could be, for example, homes that are demolished on the West Bank, or it could be Palestinians who have been refugees now for 3 generations after they were pushed out of their homes in that territory. So you see these working themselves out in different ways in what goes on in the Middle East. But they're definitely not pacifists. So It does say, for example, when the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, take them captive and besiege them, and prepare for them each ambush. Well, that sounds pretty warlike. But if they repent and establish worship and pay the poor tax, leave them their way free. Lo, Allah is most forgiving, most merciful. Okay, now here you might say, whoa, so you're saying if they convert, let them go free. And this verse is often pointed to as, okay, the Muslims converted by the sword in the Middle East. But in general, they didn't. They mostly converted by the pocketbook. That when they would take over an area, they would not tell people, you must become Muslim. It was okay, especially to be Christian or Jewish. But they would say, but, well, you know, if you want a government job, you have to be Muslim. And, well, you know, if you want to trade in this particular choice market, you should be Muslim. And so a lot of people converted not by the sword, but because it was to their favor, simply to do so. And it also says in the Quran, there should be no compulsion in religion. So the Quran explicitly forbids compelling someone to convert to Islam. Okay. Yeah, we'll leave that. So, says also in the Quran, if anyone slew a person, unless it be for murder or spreading mischief in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole people. And if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of the whole people. Okay, murder's pretty clear, but again, here you have a translation issue. What is mischief in the land? Yeah. So these, you know, it's just like a woman's ornaments. These are the places where the Quran leaves itself open to interpretation, and different people interpret things differently. So let's come back to that question. So why, when there are things in the Quran that are pretty clear, like women having pretty equal rights to men, and when there are things that are, you know, not entirely clear, but when should a woman veil herself? Why do we have these strict prohibitions, these strict rules in Muslim majority countries that don't seem to match this? So let's take a look at some more history, at the development of Sharia in the Middle East. In 632, Muhammad dies. Now, this is a big problem for the community in Medina, because they have not only lost their religious leader, they've lost their political leader as well, and Muhammad didn't have a son, not one who lived past early childhood. So what are they going to do? Muhammad leaves behind the Quran, and you have the Hadith, which are sort of his sayings and how he acted as a guide, but there's no clear succession. So half of the people in Medina say, we need to keep the succession within the family. He had daughters, and one of his daughters married his cousin Ali, so let's make Ali the next leader. These folks become known as the Shi'at Ali, partisans of Ali, and from there you get the Shia side of Islam. The other side says, no, we don't want to keep it in the family, then it's going to be sort of like a monarchy. We're going to go back to the tribal ways of choosing a sheikh, and you do that by getting the elders of the tribe together, and they essentially vote on who they think is the most responsible leader among them, and they get the leaders together of Medina, and they say, we think it should be Muhammad's really good friend Abu Bakr. The partisans of Ali give in. They say, well, all right, Ali actually says, yeah, I really respect Abu Bakr. It should be him. The community stays together. they stay together through 4 caliphs after Muhammad. So first it's his best friend Abu Bakr, then it's that fellow who came up earlier, Umar, who was the head of their military, essentially. Now, Umar is very misogynistic. He never married. He's a military guy. And under Umar, you start seeing the rights of women get whittled back. Okay, and then we have Uthman. Abu Bakr was an old man. He dies in his bed after a few years. Umar and Uthman are both assassinated, and then finally it's Ali's turn, and he also is assassinated. And it's kind of interesting because they talk about this as the golden age of the 4 rightly guided caliphs, and I'm thinking, wow, that doesn't look too golden to me when 3 out of 4 are assassinated. During this time, however, the Quran is codified, as are the Hadith, but when you get to Ali, and Ali is assassinated, then there's a problem. Okay, then there's a split, because those who were in favor of Ali say, Ali's got sons, he's got grandsons, keep it in the family. And the other folks say, nope, we're going to go back to the tribal ways. And you're also at this point getting a different feeling about, should church and state be separated? Those who want to go back to the old tribal ways say yes. Those who want to keep things in the family say we want to keep things just like they were with Muhammad. And so you get the split between the Sunni and the Shiites, and you get the first civil war between Muslim factions. And we don't have time to go into that, but it's very interesting how it all works out. However, what I do want to talk about is within the Sunni branch. Okay, these are the folks that say, we're not going to keep it in Muhammad's family. And it turns out that the partisans of Ali, they end up, in a sense, fleeing towards what is now Iran and Iraq. And that's why you find Shiites in those areas. But the Sunnis kind of become the majority. They take over the rest. Now, among the Sunnis, we get the development of 4 major ways of thinking, or schools of Islamic law or Sharia. And you can kind of see them on this map as the blue area across the top of northern Africa, the brown area in the Horn of Africa and Yemen, the rust-colored area in the middle of Saudi Arabia, and then the green area sort of up on top. That yellow area kind of in between, those are the Shiites, and we don't have time to talk about them today. So what happens? Okay, the first school to develop is the Green School that you find now up in the Stans that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, Turkey, Bosnia, that area. And these folks follow what was developed by this fellow called Abu Hanaf. He dies in 767, so we're looking at roughly 100 years, 130 years after the death of Muhammad. And they say, if you want to know what to do in a situation, go to the Quran first. If the Quran tells you what to do, that's great. If the Quran doesn't tell you what to do, use your head. Reason from what is in the Quran and try to go from there. They say a lot of the hadith are somewhat untrustworthy. We don't know that Muhammad actually said that. Don't go there. Use the Quran and reason from the Quran. Okay, this group tends to be what we would call liberal. Very liberal in their laws, because they say, all right, the Quran was written for people in the 600s. Take the spirit of the law and reason from it. And so they treat the Quran much the way that most Christians treat the Bible, saying, Extrapolate from it. What is the spirit that's being called for there? Now, we find about one generation later, about 30 years later, the Blue School, the Maliki school, they say, let's basically just try to do what the community in Medina did. Let's use community consensus here. They're not interested in reason or anagogical reasoning. They're more tribal and community-based. And they say, let's use what is best for the community and custom. And this is it's accepted across most of North Africa. And we would say, oh, they're sort of the next level of not as liberal as the Hanafi school. Then you get the Shafi'i school. Okay, this was the Horn of Africa in Yemen. And again, this is about 30 years later again, so one more generation. And they emphasize the Hadith, and sometimes even above the Quran. So this seems a bit odd, but they do that. And so they say the life and the example of Muhammad is paramount. And some of the Hadith had a long chain of transmission. It's like Muhammad said this to this person, who said it to this person, who said it to this person, who said it to this person, it to this person. So some scholars say, by the time you get to the 8th or 9th person, have you really still got what Muhammad said? Well, if any of you have played that telephone game, you probably know, not really, okay? So by the time you get to this school, it's emphasizing the Hadith, you're getting stuff that is sort of like folk wisdom, but not necessarily what Muhammad would have said. And then you get to the rust-colored that we saw in Saudi Arabia. They not only elevate the Hadith above all other sources, but they add a few of their own. I like to call this group the Revenge of the Quraysh. In other words, what you get is almost a total return to the tribal ways of the Qurayshi that preceded Muhammad. So you keep the monotheism, but in terms of everything else, in terms of the culture, in terms of the legal system, by the time you get to Hanbali school, they've gone straight back as if Muhammad didn't exist, didn't have that community in Medina, and we're going to do it the old Meccan way that we always did it before. And this is the school that is followed in Saudi Arabia, but also followed by the Taliban, followed now by more Muslims than it used to be, for a reason we'll get to in a minute. But so the Quraysh, by the time you get to 855, 900, they have happily gone back to their old ways. And that is why you'll often find that in places like Saudi Arabia, there are laws on the books that don't match the Quran at all. For example, we know that they will stone a woman caught in adultery. But that's not in the Quran. The Quran says if adultery is committed, you flog both the woman and the man, and you need 4 witnesses. So, very, very different. Yeah, question?
For the 4 schools, how do they view the prophet from those 4 schools? Does it change?
Well, not really. I mean, in some ways you could say, well, the theology doesn't change. They all still say the same creed, They all still give, but what you see changes is how they view the Quran. First of all, do they reason from the Quran? Secondly, do they even accept the Quran at all? Or do they say they accept the Quran and then kind of do what they please? Okay? And I say that by the time you get to Hanbali school, you've got people who are saying we're following the Quran, but there's nothing in the Quran about stoning. Now there is in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy says to stone the woman caught in adultery, but the Quran does not. It says no, flogging. Flogging both of them. And you need 4 witnesses to the act. So they must have been doing it in public. I don't know. So, it's very different there. So, if we come back again, you can kind of see that you're going to find the most liberal interpretations of Iran up in that top green area. Next liberal in the blue, next in the Horn of Africa, and then the least liberal is in Saudi Arabia. Now, coming out of Saudi Arabia, you find, first of all, there was this fellow called Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who lives right around 1700. And he is from the area where now is Riyadh. It's a rocky, perfectly barren desert. And he decides that the folks with the Hanbali school aren't being strict enough. And the Shiites aren't strict enough. And there are these weird guys called Sufis running around. And they're definitely not strict enough because they're into dancing and music and stuff, And so he wants to reform Islam. And he is a strong reformist. And he probably would not have gotten much traction because he's coming out of an area that not very many folks are living there in the desert, except that he makes an alliance with the tribe that is based in the area around Riyadh, which is the House of Saud. There are benefits to both sides. Teaming up with Wahhab gives the Saudis a reason, a religious reason, a reason to wage religious war against the Sufis and against the Shiites. Okay, and this is good for Wahhab. Now he's got, people who are armed behind him. And for the Sauds, they now have a religious pretext for raiding the neighbors. Okay. Wahhab gives a new understanding to jihad. The Quran is very clear that a Muslim should never kill another Muslim except for murder or spreading mischief in the land. And Wahhab says, spreading mischief in the land. Well, those Shiites, those Sufis, they're spreading mischief. They're not doing religion right. In fact, some of the Sunnis aren't doing it right. We can kill them. And this becomes a new understanding in Islam. Now, again, Wahhab's influence spreads throughout the place of the Hanbali school, so throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And it probably wouldn't have gone a lot further. Oh, by the way, they even sack Mecca. I mean, first, Wahhab and the Sauds travel up to Karbala and some of the places in Iraq that are Shiite sites and sack them. Well, because those Shiites are heretics. They're not doing the religion right. But then they even sack Mecca. You're thinking, why would they sack Mecca, of all places? But again, they're saying, well, even some of the Sunnis aren't doing things right. And for one thing, in Mecca, there was, the house where Muhammad had lived. And they tear that apart because they say people are making pilgrimages to this house, and that's wrong. The only thing that they keep as sacred and don't destroy is the Kaaba. So they sack Karbala. Then World War I comes along. Let's go 200 years, jump 200 years ahead. And we find that this rather handsome dude here, Abdul Aziz bin Abdul Rahman al Saud, makes friends with somebody. Okay, you guys are old enough, you know who that somebody is, probably. And I'm not sure I don't have a picture of him here. Lawrence of Arabia. And the British want to team up with the Sauds to have them be kind of a light paramilitary troop that's attacking the Turks around hassling their southern border. When the war is over and the British win, then the Turks, the Ottoman Empire is dissolved, and they say, well, who are we going to put in charge of this territory? Oh, well, how about our friend, Abdul Aziz bin Abdul Rahman al Saud? Let's put him in charge. And this is how the Saudis become in charge of Arabia, and it becomes Saudi Arabia. Okay? And oil. About the same time as World War I, you have the discoveries of oil and the development of Aramco and the exploitation of the Saudi oil fields, and the money that the Saudis get from oil, they use to do two things. One is to pacify the Wahhabi clerics, who now have pretty much taken over the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi princes are not living by strict Islamic standards, but they say, well, we can buy these guys off. You know, if we give them enough money, they'll leave us alone, and they won't worry about our playboy lifestyles, you know, and things like that. And they can use that money to spread the Wahhabi view of Islam, and that is what they have been doing. So the historian Bernard Lewis says, imagine if the Ku Klux Klan or the Aryan Nation obtained total control of Texas and had at its disposal all the oil revenues, and used this money to establish a network of well-endowed schools and colleges all over Christendom, peddling their particular brand of Christianity. This is what the Saudis have done with Wahhabism. So this is why you find groups like the Taliban, like ISIS, outside of Saudi Arabia, that are essentially taking this ultra-strict Hanbali vision of Islam and spreading it to the rest of the world. And I saw this myself. I did a Fulbright and taught in Sarajevo in Bosnia. And I started going to Bosnia about 6 years after the war there, and went there every year for about 10 years. And when I first started going to Bosnia, you did not see a veiled woman in Bosnia. If you saw a woman in a kerchief, you were looking at somebody's babushka, okay? But by the time I stopped going to Bosnia, you saw quite a few veiled women. What happened was that during the war there, most of the mosques and 97% of the minarets were destroyed. After the war, they needed money to rebuild these mosques. And guess where a lot of the money came from? It came from Saudi Arabia. And it often came with a string attached. And at the other end of that string was a Wahhabi cleric. So they said, we'll rebuild your mosque for you. And you know what? We'll staff it too. Aren't you lucky? And they sent Wahhabi clerics to Bosnia, where they started teaching a very different form of Islam than the form of Islam that had been in Bosnia before the war, which was Hanafi. So it was the green school, the most liberal school, and it was very strongly influenced by Sufism. There are a lot of Sufis. That changed after the war. It didn't change completely, and you still find a lot of Hanafi Muslims and Sufis in Bosnia. But now you also find Wahhabism, because that's where the money came from to rebuild the mosques. Okay, so we look at things that we see in the news, and we have to ask ourselves, is it religion, or is it religious, or is it cultural? And even the people themselves will often say, well, this is religious, this is part of my religion, But it's not in the Quran. It's not what Muhammad did or practiced. It's what predated that. Or it's what your tribe did, wherever you happen to be. You can say, well, but now it's become a part of the religion, and for those people it has, but for others it has not. Okay. A Gallup poll was done. This is about 10 years old now. It was 6 years of research and more than 50,000 interviews of Muslims in 35 nations. And here's some of the things that the poll revealed. Muslims are slightly more likely than Americans to reject attacks on civilians as morally unjustifiable. Large majorities of Muslims would guarantee free speech if it were up to them and write new constitutions for their countries. And they say that religious leaders should have no direct role in that. What they least admire about the West is its perceived breakdown of traditional values. The same answers that Americans give when asked this question. And when asked about their dreams for the future, Muslims say they want better jobs and security and just to raise their children in peace, not conflict or violence. Okay, so why is there so much Islamic terrorism and unrest? Why is the Middle East always in turmoil? I think there are two reasons. Here's the first reason. There's a youth bulge. Over 30% of the people in the Middle East are between age 15 and 29. That's a lot of youth. And there's little opportunity for many of them. In Egypt, 26% of the youth are unemployed. 51% of them are living in poverty. When I was in Iran, I found that a lot of the young people I met had university degrees, but they couldn't get jobs that would use those degrees. So some of the young men who were tourist guides had university degrees in mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, but they couldn't get better jobs. And for many of the youth then, they can't marry. Because you can't marry until you can afford a place to live and afford to take care of a wife. So there's a lot of people feeling pretty unhappy. They don't know what their identity is. They've been raised on Western music, Western clothing, but at the same time they have, this cultural past. They don't quite know how to blend the two. And in Europe, where you find a lot of Muslims have come as refugees, they talk, for example, in Belgium about gangster jihadis. They say they got a joint in one hand and a beer in the other, and that a lot of it, again, is from youth unemployment, poverty. They end up moving in and out of overcrowded jails where they get converted to the kind of Wahhabi viewpoint. And young people also tend to be idealistic and utopian. And this was a big reason why a lot of young people joined ISIS. They presented them with this utopian vision that we're going to go back to restoring the caliphate of the four rightly guided caliphs, this golden age. And of course, that isn't what happened. Second reason, climate change. If you look at the places where there is the most unrest, you also find that these are the places that over the last several years have experienced the worst drought. And this has meant that a lot of people have left the villages where they were farmers. They've gone to the cities because the crops have died year after year in a row. And they go to the cities, but there's nothing for them there either. So this is adding to the level of unrest. Okay, so that's the side we often see in the media. If you say, well, it's what the people do, well, we see that terrorist side in the media. What are the regular people doing? What are they told to do by their religion? People have often said that a lot of people around the world are converting to Islam, and it's one of the fastest growing religions in America, because it's simple. Because basically, you only have to do 5 things. Well, let's look at those 5 things. The first thing you have to do is, at some point, you have to say the Shahada, a sincere profession publicly of the fact that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is God's messenger. Okay, say that and you're in. You're a Muslim. Okay, then what do you have to do? Pray 5 times a day. Muslims believe that the root of all sin is forgetting. They say that's the problem. They don't believe that we are born sinful, that there's original sin. They say, no, we are all born pure and clean, and as natural Muslims who would believe in God and do good, but we forget. We forget who we really are, and it's forgetting that causes us to fall into sin. Forgetting God and forgetting our own rightful nature that we were born with. So they say pray 5 times a day, and that's going to help you remember God. You have to stop what you're doing and pray. I also find myself thinking, who else prays 5 times a day or 7 times a day? The monks. I teach up at St. John's. The monks stop for prayer several times a day. And then I think back to Muhammad traveling, through the desert and up into Christian areas, and think, I'm sure he encountered monastic groups that were praying multiple times a day. You have to fast. Okay, fast during the month of Ramadan. I already mentioned, though, that you don't have to fast if it's going to cause you any problem. And interestingly enough, although you would think, well, that'd be a good time for Muslims to lose a little weight, they say, well, no, actually, I always gain weight during Ramadan. Because although they fast all day, as soon as that sun goes down, party! So you can see on the bottom picture, you'd think, okay, there's a really weird picture she put up for a slide on fasting. You've got a whole bunch of people having a great big feast, but that's what they do. So as soon as the sun goes down, everybody parties. They have special foods that they only make during Ramadan, and it's a fairly good time until the sun comes up again in the morning. Many live through the month of Ramadan sort of like Christians do Lent. In other words, they'll say, well, we're supposed to fast from food. It's actually harder than that. You're supposed to fast from water and drinking anything, and from sex, and from smoking. Anything, you just don't take anything into the body from sunup to sundown. So this can be very hard when Ramadan, because they're on a lunar calendar, Ramadan moves through the year. When it happens, in summertime, it can be pretty hard to go all day without drinking water. But it's also a time where they say, a lot of Muslims will say, well, this is a time when I sit down and I read the whole Quran. This is a time when I may give something up for Ramadan, the same way we might give up something for Lent. Say, well, I'm going to give up video games for Ramadan or something like that. So it becomes a time of spiritual renewal for them, as well as fasting. Now, a part of that spiritual renewal is that during this month, this is often the time when they are enjoined to give to charity. They pay something called the zakat, which we could think of in a way as analogous to tithing, but it's a little different. For them, for one thing, it's about 2.5%. But it isn't 2.5% of what you earned that year. It's 2.5% of the value of everything you own. Oh my gosh, yeah. But not everything you own. Because, again, let's be practical. Everybody needs a house. right? So the value of your house doesn't count. That helps, right? But if you own 2 houses, nobody needs 2 houses, so the second house you got to figure in. Same thing with transportation. Everybody needs their camel, right? Or their donkey or whatever. Everybody needs a car. So every person in the household is allowed a car. Now, if you got more cars than you got people in your household, then the extra cars you've got to pay. And you got to pay for that boat, unless you need the boat, like to get to where you need to go. Same thing like snowmobile. Yeah, count the snowmobile, but don't count the snowmobile if you live in Alaska and you need the snowmobile to get it. Be practical, in other words. The tools of your trade, they don't count, okay? But yeah, your bank account, that counts. So how do you figure all this out? Well, these days, there's an app for that. There's there's lots of apps for that. By the way, the same thing with prayer and fasting. How do you figure out which way is Mecca? Easy. Whip out your cell phone, there's an app for that. It'll say, oh, yeah, Mecca, that's that way. So you know which way to face. The same thing with fasting. Sun up or sundown, put your phone on GPS and it'll tell you exactly when the sun goes up and down at your place. So lots of handy apps for all of this. And then the final one, pilgrimage to Mecca, to do the Hajj. Now, this one is the only one of these that is not mandatory. Okay, so you have to say the Shahada. You should pray 5 times a day, and you should pray at the set times, but if you can't, you can say your prayer at a different time. Okay? You should fast during Ramadan, but if you can't, you can fast at a different time if you need to. And if you can't fast, you can't fast. That's okay. You should pay your charity. Okay? The pilgrimage, well, you should make it if you can, but there was always the recognition that for some people it would just be impossible for them to travel and make the pilgrimage. So that one is completely optional. And those are the 5 pillars. So, if we take a look, whoops, let me go back. I didn't put a slide for that, but take a look at these. Prayer, fasting, giving to the poor, making pilgrimage, saying you believe in God. Do any of those sound very different from Christianity? No, they're the same things that are enjoined to us, particularly in the New Testament. So we have something here that isn't all that different as a religion. In fact, the priest John of Damascus, who was in Syria and lived in, I think, like around the 800s, he said Islam is a Christian heresy. He was writing a treatise on what are all the different Christian heresies, and he said, and Islam, it's a Christian heresy. They're basically Christians, it's just they have a little trouble with the Trinity. Because they were so against polytheism, that this idea of the Trinity kind of weirds them out. So, but other than that, he said, so they're like many other Christian heresies that couldn't quite figure out the nature of Jesus and don't match the Council of Nicaea. In the Quran, there's a very interesting verse that I find. There's a little piece of it up here. And in it, God says, I could have made you all one religion, but I didn't. Why not? So that you could compete with one another in doing good works. So, we find there something very similar to what we read in Hebrews, where it says, let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. So in the Quran, God says, I could have made you all one religion. Probably would have been simpler that way, right? But I didn't. Why not? Because this way you will convive with one another to do good. Okay, I haven't said anything about the Sufis, but I'm going to give Rumi the last word here. Sufis is a whole nother talk. But he writes, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make sense. I think this fits with that idea that we are different faiths. And often we vie with one another, and not in a good way, not to see who can do the most good deeds, but to see who can have the power over the other. Often we say, I have my ideas about wrongdoing and right doing, and yours are wrong. And Rumi says, well, beyond all of that, there's a field. And in this field, where wrongdoing and right doing and clinging to my way of doing things, the world is too full to talk about all of that. And to talk about each other, to talk about them and us. Because we really are brothers and sisters in faith. And I kind of think that we've seen that field. Here's the picture that came. Most of you have probably seen this from the James Webb Telescope. Looking at this immense, beautiful universe that we live in, with galaxy upon galaxy upon galaxy. I mean, to realize this is only one tiny little corner of the whole universe that surrounds us. And there you see galaxy after galaxy after galaxy. And we are one tiny little planet on one tiny little galaxy in this whole vast universe that God made, and this incredibly beautiful universe that God made. And I think out in this field, some of those ideas we cling to about right doing and wrong doing and us versus them, it doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense. So, along with Rumi, I think we need to kind of let our souls lie down in that grass and recognize that we're all brothers and sisters on this one little planet. And like God said, we're not exactly the same, but we should vie with one another to do good and serve each other. And as deacons, I think that is what you all have professed that you will do within your church and then more broadly among all the people that you come in contact with. And I just want to send my blessings to all of you and my thanks to all of you for doing that. And thank you very much. You've been a wonderfully patient audience.
So thanks so much, Noreen. It's been a wonderful, wonderful presentation as you did several years ago here in this area. One example, at the Newman Center in Carbondale, the Knights of Columbus do a morning rosary at 6 a.m. And anyway, as I drive from St. Francis Xavier Parish, the 5 blocks or whatever it is, to the Newman Center for the rosary, I pass one of the local mosques in Carbondale. And there are cars lined up in the parking lot at 6 o'clock in the morning. They're doing their prayers as I'm going to do my rosary with my brothers at the Newman Center. The women join us once a month for that. But thank you so much to our deacons and wives for listening to this presentation, and thank you again, Noreen. Appreciate it.